What could possibly go wrong? 40,000 people gathered in Texas heat for the ultimate show. Two massive steam locomotives, throttled to full speed, hurtling directly towards each other. They brought their families and cheered for the impact. But as the steel screamed and the boilers ignited, the crash at Crush turned into a nightmare. In a split second, a marketing stunt became a rain of jagged iron. This is the story of the day 40,000 people watched in horror as a publicity stunt became a massacre. The year is 1896, a blistering day in September in the heart of Texas. The railroads are the lifeblood of the nation, and the Katy rail line is king. On this particular day, something's about to happen that has never happened before in American history, and it hasn't happened since. A temporary town is about to appear overnight. A pop-up town with its own depot, streets of tents and vendors, a massive dining hall, bandstands, even a jail, rising from the empty Texas grassland like a mirage. 40,000 people are pouring in by the trainload, but they aren't here for a fair or a speech. They're here for a marketing stunt. A railroad executive with a wild idea. Take two 35-ton steam locomotives, fire them up to full steam, hurl them at each other at 60 miles an hour, just to see what happens. The Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad decided the best way to sell tickets was to destroy two of their own locomotives. And people came. 40,000 people flooded this pop-up town, all to watch the spectacle of a century, but the engineers got it wrong. What was supposed to be a controlled, thrilling crash became a catastrophe in a matter of seconds. A massive boiler explosion, jagged iron shrapnel raining down on families, a quote, safe stunt that turned into a battlefield. The railroad covered it up, fired the man responsible, and quietly rehired him when the headlines turned positive. This isn't folklore, this is a real event, a real town that existed for exactly one day, and you've never heard a word about it. Tonight we're diving deep into the story of the crash at Crush, a story of corporate greed, ego, and a town that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Trust me, by the end of this you'll be asking yourself, how did anyone think this was a good idea? What happened on September 15th, 1896 is going to blow your mind. We're off the beaten path. To understand how this madness started, you have to meet the man behind it, William George Crush. He wasn't an engineer or a conductor, he was a passenger agent, a PR man. In 1896, the Katy Railroad was struggling. Competition was fierce. Crush needed something Texas-sized. He went to his bosses with the proposal. Let's take two obsolete steam engines, advertise a head-on collision, and charge people to watch. Now you'd think the board of directors would call security. Instead, they gave him the green light. Now you might be wondering, why would a massive corporation risk two perfectly good locomotives just for show? The answer is simple. The house always wins. See, the only way for most people to get to the middle of nowhere field was on a Katy train, and Katy wasn't giving those tickets away. Tickets ranged from $2 from Austin to $3.50 from Houston. Now in 1896 that sounds like a bargain, but let's do the math. In today's money, those round-trip tickets cost anywhere from $60 to over $100, and that just gets you to the door. Once you arrived in Crush, the meter was still running. You had to pay for food, the drinks, the sideshow entertainment, every dime flowing back to the railroad's pockets. When you multiply that by 40,000 people, it becomes clear. This wasn't just a stunt, it was a massive cash grab. The Katy Railroad wasn't just selling the crash, they were selling the seats to watch it, and they stood to make a fortune as long as everything went according to plan. But as we're about to see, the plan was the first thing to go off the rails. Because Crush knew he couldn't just have a crash in a random field, he needed a stage. He chose a site 15 miles north of Waco. This wasn't some rinky-dink setup. Katy went big. He drilled wells for the water, laid down 4 miles of track, and built a 2,100-foot station platform, even borrowed a huge circus tent from the Ringling Brothers and turned it into a restaurant, serving lunches from the railroad's own dining service. Outside that tent was an entire midway. Lemonade stands, soft drink dispensers, game booths, medicine shows, the works. And there were even 2 telegraph offices, a grandstand, and even a jail, just in case. In just a few weeks, a city appeared from where there had been nothing but grass, and to top it off, he named it after himself, Crush, Texas. The engineers warned him. They told Crush these train boilers weren't built for impact, that they would detonate on contact. But Crush had 40,000 tickets to sell, and he told the press the engines would simply telescope into each other and stop. Unfortunately, he was betting on physics he didn't understand, and in a few hours, 40,000 people would pay the price for Crush's ignorance. September 15th arrived. The Katy Railroad offered special excursion trains from every corner of Texas. For a couple of bucks, you could book a round-trip ticket to the event of the century. By midday, the population of Crush, Texas hit about 40,000 people. To put that into perspective, for those few hours, this temporary camp was one of the most populated spots in the entire state, rivaling the size of Dallas or San Antonio for the time. The atmosphere was electric. It was a carnival. People were betting on which train would, quote, win. The two stars of the show were parked at opposite ends of the track. Engine number 999 painted in a brilliant green, and engine number 1001 painted deep red. Each would pull 3 cars in a caboose to their demise. But as the sun began to set, the mood shifted. The railroad safety experts started pushing the crowd back. They told everyone to stay 200 yards away from the track, and they said this was just a precaution. But some people noticed the engineers, the men who were supposed to jump off the trains at the last second, looking a little pale. The fact is, they knew something the crowd didn't. They knew these engines weren't just metal, they were bombs. And at 5 p.m., William Crush raised his white hat, the signal, the point of no return. The whistle screamed, the engineers opened the throttles and tied them into place, and jumped after 400 yards. From that moment on, the two machines were ghost trains, unmanned, accelerating, and locked on a collision course. The green 999 and the red number 1001 accelerated. 10 miles per hour, 30, 50, the ground began to shake. 40,000 people held their breath. Impact. The sound was like a thunderclap that could be heard in Waco 15 miles away. The front ends of the locomotives vanished into a cloud of dust and splinters, and for a second it looked exactly like William Crush had promised, a spectacular mechanical crunch. And then the world exploded. The boilers filled with superheated steam couldn't hold the shock. They didn't just break, they detonated like bombs. Thousands of pounds of jagged iron, bolts, and scalding water were hurled into the sky. A blizzard of metal rained down on the crowd, and people who thought they were a safe distance suddenly found themselves in a war zone. A young man named Ernest Darnell, who had climbed into a tree to get a better view, was struck and killed instantly. A woman in the crowd was hit by a flying bolt. A photographer for the railroad lost an eye. Dozens more were burned or scalded by steam and struck by flying iron. In an instant, the cheers turned to screams, and the spectacle had become a massacre. It took about 2 minutes for the two locomotives to cover the ground at the point of collision. The Dallas Morning News reported the next day, quote, "A scene that will haunt a man, make him nervous whenever he hears an engine whistle, and disturb his dreams with black clouds of death dealing iron hail." End quote. As the smoke cleared, the scene was horrific. The two proud engines were nothing but a pile of blackened, twisted scrap. But the real story was what happened next. You'd think the Katy Railroad would be ruined. You'd think William Crush would be heading to prison. That evening, the railroad officially fired Crush. They issued a statement expressing regret. But behind the scenes, the corporate machine was already moving. They sent crews in to clear the wreckage immediately. They settled lawsuits on the spot with cash payments to the injured. And the public, in a strange twist of human psychology, the crash at Crush became a legend. The public rushed to the tracks, not in horror, but for souvenirs, grabbing bits of twisted steel and wood. What they didn't take, the railroad hauled away to be sold as scrap metal. And the next morning, the city was being folded up and shipped away. And William Crush, the man who was fired for his negligence, the railroad officially fired Crush that evening, but the firing was a PR stunt of its own. Within days, once the railroad realized the public was more fascinated than furious, Crush was quietly brought back into the fold. The stunt that should have ended his career instead became a strange kind of calling card. Crush stayed with the Katy Railroad for the rest of his life, working his way up to and finally retiring as a senior executive in 1940, 44 years after the stunt. By the next morning, the town of Crush, Texas was gone. The tents were folded, the tracks were pulled up, and 40,000 people went home. If you look out your window while you're driving north from Waco, you'll see miles of open fields and the occasional glint of a railroad track. Somewhere in that expanse is the site of Crush, Texas. It's unmarked, unmapped, and largely ignored by thousands of drivers who pass it every day. The prairie has reclaimed the ground, leaving no trace of the twisted iron or the thousands of souls who once crowded these tracks. Because sometimes the only thing louder than the cheers is the silence that follows. Thanks for watching. If this story blew your mind, hit the like and subscribe button for more hidden history. And let me know in the comments, would you have bought a ticket to Crush? We're off the beaten path. We'll see you at the next chapter of the past.